A few months ago, William Schneider Jr. arrived at the CAPS Media Center with an absolute treasure trove of Ventura history. Bill's father, William Schneider Sr., was a highly respected teacher throughout Ventura. For years, his hobby was recording on camera interviews and family histories with fascinating people all over the county. Recently, his son, Bill Jr., gathered together more than 100 tapes from his father's archives, and working here at the CAPS Media Center, has painstakingly restored these treasures. Bill's new series, called My Father's Stories, explores some of the very early days of Ventura County. Most of the videos were recorded 20 to 30 years ago. The people, places, and stories Bill shares are part of Ventura's rich history. Welcome to My Father's Stories.
Bill, you've got so many great stories. Who are we gonna learn about today?
Today's show is about James Lloyd-Butler and the Butler Ranch. The Butler Ranch is one of the oldest ranchos in Ventura County. It started as a Mexican land grant, and the original grantee was Juan Sanchez. It was called the Rancho Santa Clara del Norte. And then in 1860, there was a horrible drought, and Juan got into debt and lost the ranch. Then a man by the name of Antonio Saca de Pedra obtained the note from the bank. He, along with his brothers, all from Italy, came over to help run the ranch. Antonio had a brother named Leopoldo, and Leopoldo married James Lloyd-Butler's aunt, Amparo Armas. Antonio passed away, and Leopoldo was the sole heir to the rancho. Leopoldo was responsible for developing the rancho more than his older brother. And one of the most key important things for a ranch development is water accessibility. And Leopoldo actually built a dam where the Friedman Diversion Dam presently sits. And he diverted the water, and he dug a ditch all the way to Waineve, where there were some lemon orchards and orange orchards, and they supplied the water there. That ditch was eventually a road, and they called it Ditch Road, and it was eventually changed to Rose Avenue, as we all know today.
Now, you learned all that research. How did your father find out what was going on?
My father, once again, researched James Lloyd-Butler. Actually, my father was born and raised in Saticoy, and my grandfather had a ranch just east of Victoria and just south of Telephone. It was a walnut ranch of about 150 acres, but they lost it in the Depression. And that's how he knows all these pioneering families of Ventura County, simply because they all worked together in the farming community of Saticoy and Ventura.
Well, great. Let's see the story.
We're so fortunate to be at one of the most picturesque of the older ranches in Ventura County. And we're visiting with Jim Lloyd-Butler. Jimmy, how are you?
Fine, thank you, Bill.
You're looking well.
Thank you.
You're a busy man now.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, can you tell us something about the beginnings here?
You mean the beginnings from my time, or the beginnings from the
your
ranch itself?
Yeah, your great-grandfather?
Well,
Grandfather.
actually, the original grantee was Juan Sanchez.
Mm-hmm.
And Juan Sanchez, I guess they got into debt during the drought of around 1860.
Oh, yeah.
And the Antonio Schiappa Pietra obtained the note on the property. This is what I've heard from the Historical Society.
Yeah.
My parents didn't tell me this, but and they and Antonio foreclosed on the note and obtained the property from the Sanchez family, and that was, I say, around 1860. And then he had come here from Italy. In fact, I think before that he'd gone to South America, and then he'd come here. He'd come to Santa Barbara, and he had a shop, I believe, in Santa Barbara and one in Ventura. And then he took over the property here, and his brother Federico came from Italy to help him, and Federico died on a trip to San Francisco. He died in San Luis Obispo, lay down under a tree, and they went to wake him up, and I guess the stagecoach had stopped in not San Luis, but San Juan Bautista, and he was dead. So they shipped him back here in a barrel of brandy, I believe, and buried him. And then Leopoldo came from Italy to help his brother, and he was the youngest, apparently, of the three brothers. And Leopoldo happened to marry my mother's aunt, whose name was Amparo Arenas, and they eventually Antonio died, and Leopoldo was then the heir of the property, and so he actually developed it, I think, a lot more than it had been. It had been mainly, I believe, a sheep and cattle ranch, and they developed water, and I guess Antonio did too at the time, because Antonio was one of the original directors of the Santa Clara Water and Irrigating Company that they had a dam in the river up about where the Freeman Diversion is now, a little bit farther west of that. And they there was the water that was diverted and went down Ditch Road, which is now Rose Avenue, and they had rights of way all the way to Fort Hueneme. And
did the ditch go down that far?
I don't think it ever did, but I know when my father was still alive, every now and then somebody would come by or come out and want a quitclaim on the easements that they had through their property.
They could have,
And-
but
mhm,
yeah.
mhm.
Okay.
And even right up until just before or maybe during the Second World War, they were delivering water to the McGraths down about where the Shopping at the Rose is now.
Yeah.
They used to irrigate their walnuts that they had in there.
Yeah.
And let's see. You asked at the beginning of the ranch. The Leopoldo and Amparo more or less adopted my mother when her mother, who was Amparo's sister, died, and her father wasn't able to take care of her, and so her uncle and aunt brought her up from the time she was about 10 years old, and then they died about 1908. They died in Italy, and my mother inherited the main part of the ranch. They call it the home ranch, which at that time was about 1,700 acres.
I was going to ask you, how big was this ranch when your great uncle?
Well, the
got here
original,
first?
yeah, when he got it,
Sanchez.
he and the Solaris were sort of partners,
Yeah.
and it was about 13,000 acres, I believe, at that time.
This was a Spanish grant?
It was a Mexican
Grant,
Mhm.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and but they there's a story that Phil Hardison told at the Ventura County Historical Society meeting here a couple of years ago that when Mr. Solari died, that Antonio went to the courthouse. There was nothing signed, but he told them that half of it was his and half of it was Solari's, and they just split
it down.
and they hired some appraisers, and they came in and appraised it, and the Solaris got their portion, and the Scapapietras got their portion. But my mother, as I say, inherited the home ranch, and she had a sister and 2 brothers, and they inherited some property. And then the will was contested because various people. I don't think that Antonio was ever married, but no, I guess he was married at one time. But there were a lot of the people that came that claimed to be heirs of
Shirt-tail
Antonio.
relatives began to show up.
And so it was a contested will, and I think it was Selby and Ventura that represented. Mr. Power was the executor for Leopoldo, and I think it was Mr. Selby that represented my mother and the estate. And then there were Mr. Farrell.
Yep.
He was a lawyer for the Italian heirs, and that's how I believe that's how they happened to get their property, because they took his legal fee in land, and the Farrows then obtained quite a bit of property at that time, and so that's about how. Then eventually, my mother died in 1940, and my father inherited the property, and then he remarried a few years later, and then he died in '73, and then at that time the Saticoy Country Club property right over here was sold to the country club. It had been an option, lease option, and then when my stepmother died, we owed I guess it was
bundle.
over $1 million, and you can't make $1 million very well in farming.
No.
And so we sold some of what we consider the more non-productive property to the Huntsingers, and up on the hill here in back of the country club, and we held on to the good farmland. But at least they have planted avocados on some of that. But,
Jim, tell us about the history of the agriculture on this. You said it started out as cattle and sheep, and when did they go into? Well, I guess when they got water.
I think it was
crops?
well, when the Santa Clara Water and Irrigating Company was formed in around 1871, I think, because yes, it was in existence for a little over 100 years, and I'm not sure of all the exact sequence, but when they got water, well, then they were able to start planting sugar beets and beans and tree crops, and of course, as you know, there were lots of walnuts here at one time.
Yeah.
You remember when you were going to harvest the walnuts with
a machine? Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
First and last attempt.
And I remember that. We had about 200 acres of walnuts at the time, and I had. This was in 1950, and I had gone to graduated from St. Mary's, and then I went to Cal Poly for a couple of years, and I just had come back to start working here. And my father had told, at that time they used families to pick the walnuts, and my father had told the the people that he would only need 3 families, where we'd usually use about 10. And because you and who was it, Ed Baskin?
Ed Buckner.
Ed Buckner, that's right.
Yeah.
And you were going to harvest with that food machinery walnut harvester.
Yeah.
And the darn thing didn't work.
Didn't work.
No. So then we scrounged around. By that time, most of the walnut pickers were pretty well situated.
Yeah.
So I remember we got some gypsies in here, and they were terrible. God, they wouldn't fill their sacks, and finally, I guess I gave them so much trouble that, or maybe they gave me so much trouble too, that they left. And then we were able to get, I think it was a dozen or 15 Mexican nationals from the Bracero program, and that was great.
They worked hard. Yeah.
Yeah, and we were able to get the crop in. But,
Jim, tell us about this beautiful home.
oh, excuse me, but you mentioned that. Of course, then the walnuts eventually became unproductive. Well, they weren't so unproductive, but they could grow them a lot cheaper and with less pest control and so forth in the San Joaquin Valley and in the Sacramento Valley.
And they could pick them in one picking.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
Here you had 3 pickings at least.
Right. And so walnuts eventually we have one tree left over there in the corner.
Yeah.
And they eventually were, I don't think there are more than 100 acres left in the whole county now.
I think there are
maybe a few up in Ojai.
Ojai, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And but then of course lemons became the much bigger crop in the county here, and eventually vegetable crops. Tomatoes were a big crop. Remember, they used to grow a lot of pole tomatoes, and
Sure.
they don't grow many anymore because it's too expensive.
Costs
I
too
guess
much.
the labor costs are too high.
They'd rather do strawberries.
So they grow strawberries and
Celery.
and celery and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, let's talk about your home, Jim.
Well, that was the original part of the house was built in around 1831 by the Sanchez family.
That's 160 years ago.
About that, and then in about 1899, Leopoldo added the second floor and the wing where the kitchen is, and over the kitchen there are what used to be servants' quarters, so that's as I say, the lower part, except for that addition, was all adobe, and I guess the porch must have been added at the same time. But,
Is this what you would call Italian architect?
you know, we've never been able to find any old records or architectural drawings or anything of the. But I'm not sure what you call it.
Okay.
It's
beautiful.
Sort of the what's the Camarillo house? You remember? You know what they call that? I can't remember.
I mean, the big porch. All this goes around what, 2 sides of the house, or 3 sides?
Around about 3 sides.
3 sides.
That, See, in the ceiling of the porch and under the floor, there are pipes for the hot water heating. And so they sort of disguise
the solar heating
pipes.
program.
Mm-hmm. Not solar, it's just hot water.
Because your heat collects up there, right?
Yeah, the hot water, I think originally the hot water was heated in an old furnace, the old furnace with oil. And and then now we have gas. In fact, the old furnace we donated to Bob Filer for the Historical Society. And we replaced it about 7 or 8 years ago.
Jim, what is the connection here between this ranch and the great town of Saticoy? Do you remember any stories about that? How they?
All I can, when we were going through some of the old things that were left here after in the barn out here, we found a pillar that was in the house. Apparently, the dining room, which is now one big room, it's about 30 by 15, I guess, and there was a pillar, and it said and they had taken down, and they had replaced that. There were two pillars that were holding up the the ceiling, I guess. And then they put a beam in instead and took out the pillars. And we noticed that on the bottom of one of the pillars it said Saticoy Milling Company.
Oh.
And so I don't know what the Saticoy Milling Company was, but that must have made some of the lumber and all that and the construction work that when they
built
when they added on.
Added on.
Mm-hmm.
They floated it across the river. That was before the bridge.
I guess so. Yeah.
I can remember your father in John Madison's hardware
Oh
store.
gosh, I was talking about that the other day. And I remember we'd go over and pick up the mail, and we'd have to sit outside while Dad was in there talking to John Madison.
Yeah.
And he called him Jack, I think.
Yeah.
Jack Madison.
Well, there was a son Jack.
Was there?
Yeah.
And then, because we were thinking about that because Vic Muzio died.
Yes.
And I was telling somebody the Muzios had a grocery store first, and then they bought the hardware store from Madison.
Yeah.
But I know my brother Pat was here a couple of nights ago, and he remembered. I didn't remember, but he remembered an old Model T that the Madison had and they had a plumber at that time they used.
Will Dick?
Was that what his name was?
Yeah.
I don't remember. But he said you had the small little Model T truck, and this was a big truck, much bigger than the little, sort of like a half-ton that they had. But, Of course, the walnuts were always taken to Saticoy and for after they were dried here, and the beans for the bean house.
Ashby Vickers tells about swimming in the old
in the
ditch.
Canal, in the ditch.
Canal,
Yes.
that was part of your distribution system.
Yes.
Now, do you still use river water?
We do, because we have certain rights that that my father reserved when the United Water Conservation District took over. You remember originally that was the Santa Clara River Conservation District, and then about 1952, I believe it was, United. They made it much. They took over a much bigger tax base, and then it was from then on it was called United Water Conservation District, and at that time, in 27, the Santa Clara Water Conservation District was formed, and my parents allowed them to use a couple of acres as sort of a test area when Mr. Freeman was the head of it, and at that time they used our dam to divert the water into their little spreading area that they had, and then eventually they built their own dam, but it was below our dam, and I wasn't here at the time, but I guess the logic was that there wasn't much sense in having two little. There were they were just sand diversions, and there wasn't much sense in having two. So when United took over, and they bought the land, then my father reserved the right for 300 inches of water out of their canal, which is 2,700 gallons a minute. And so that gives us a pretty good supply of water.
That's a good base. On wet years, anyway.
Yeah, but of course now with the diversion in and with the Piru Dam and all, there's a fairly sure.
There's over 100,000 acre feet.
Yes, and they released the water during the summer, but when was it, in 1990, right at the end of the last drought? Things were pretty bad at that time. But since then, they put the Freeman diversion in, and they've diverted an awful lot of water. And I think chances of a drought similar to what we had in the late 80s and early 90s were probably not very great now.
Jim, let's digress a minute. You may not know this, but the Lloyd-Butler Ranch was quite a recreational area for those of us on the other side of the river. When we were Boy Scouts and all that, we'd come over and have a camp over here by the dam that you're talking about, and explore that cliff, that mountain. And there was an old cave back in there.
Yes, we used to go down in the cave.
Yeah.
And I don't even know where it is now. Maybe it's disappeared.
It could have.
Erosion and all.
Sure.
But I remember when my sister Claire was 6 years older than I, and the whole lot of us went up there one time, and she died when I was only 7, and so I probably was about 5 years old at the time. And they took candles and flashlights and went down in that cave.
Yes.
And I remember, I don't know what my parents probably didn't even
They
know
didn't
what
know
was
about
going
it.
on.
Yeah,
But I remember Claire actually just got down on her belly and crawled through some very narrow areas.
Yeah.
And as I say, I don't think that my parents knew what was going on.
I had been lectured, don't go into caves, so I didn't. I was going to ask you about the chapel.
The story goes that the chapel was Leopoldo's card room. And about 1928, Mr. Carroll, who was a contractor, he was the father of the Carroll that was with Bank of Alevia. He died about
A real gentleman.
Yes, I think he died about 1975 or 80, somewhere in there. But his father was the one that converted what had been the card room into a chapel. But my parents had friends that were priests that would come and spend the night, and then they'd say mass there in the morning, and then actually it's been used in the last few years. My daughter was married there, and the priest married them in the chapel, and then we had a reception here in the garden. And my father was buried from there. It's too small to put a casket in the chapel, but they brought the hearse alongside, and then the priest said mass, and so it's still used occasionally.
Great.
Bill Clark's one of his grandchildren was baptized there. I remember you can get 12 people in the chapel, I think, and the priest said that baby when he grows up, he can always tell people that there was a full church.
Full house.
When he was baptized. Yeah.
Well, this has been fun.
Well, it has.
It's been fun. I appreciate your time, and
Well,
we're off on schedule.
good.